Hi, and welcome to The Horn, a podcast from International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. In mid-October, President Trump announced that the U.S. government would be lifting its 27-year-old sanctions on Sudan as a designated state sponsor of terror. Today on the podcast, we have Jonas Horner, Crisis Group's senior analyst on Sudan, as well as Deputy Horn of Africa Director. He's just back from Khartoum and here to talk to us about where Sudan is at a year and a half after the ouster of President Omar al-Bashir. Jonas, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me.
So, Jonas, you just returned from a few weeks in Khartoum. I'm wondering, what's the state of the transition now on the ground?
Well, it's not good. You can't make a mistake about that. The transition is in deep trouble. And this is particularly because the economy really drags everything down. You really, as you move around Khartoum in particular, people are quite frustrated about having to stay in long queues for fuel and for bread. And the general economic malaise really does do irreversible damage to the civilian government. And I think it damages also the civilians as a potential governing dispensation in the future. People are frustrated, and a lot of that came out in recent protests about a week ago. The Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, continues to be very timid in spending the political capital he has. That political capital has been waning for some time now. And on top of it, the Forces for Freedom and Change, who really were meant to be the stewards for the revolution and for civilians generally, really haven't been good stewards for all of the instincts of Sudan's revolution. There have been a couple of achievements, though, in recent times, the first being the signing of the Juba Agreement between most of Sudan's armed groups and the transitional government. And then perhaps even more recently, and with greater fanfare, the promise from the U.S. administration to remove Sudan from its state sponsor of terrorism list. Neither have really changed the tone, though, it must be said, and the economy really remains uppermost in people's minds.
So the big news is, of course, the announcement from President Trump that he will delist Sudan from the state sponsor of terror designation. That's after 27 years since the Clinton administration first imposed those sanctions. We've, of course, talked about it at length on this podcast. It's something the Sunnis people have been waiting for a very long time. Now that that's happened, now what? When can we expect to see any changes?
Well, all the way from the transitional government and prime minister's office down to people on the street who are moving about their daily lives, there is real interest in this state sponsor of terrorism (SST) issue, and there has also been a belief from top to bottom in Sudanese society of a fairly immediate economic bounce, and the evidence from, for example, the 2017 removal of U.S. sanctions on Sudan, suggests that is unlikely to occur. First of all, there is still a technical process that the U.S. government has to go through. So rescission of SST has not happened yet. But the advantages of SST on the economic side will only be apparent in the medium to longer terms. Immediately, though, this really should be a win politically for Prime Minister Hamdok, who really needs it. And I'm a little surprised that he has not been more, vociferous in taking some credit for this. After all, a key component and selling point for him as he came in as the Forces for Freedom and Change candidate for Prime Minister was that he would be able to mobilize economic assistance and to engage more robustly with the international community. In the medium to longer term, those economic benefits could be really the removal of significant barriers to critical banking relationships. It eases investors' concerns about reputational risk in Sudan, and also allows the U.S. to support debt relief for Sudan at the key international financial institutions. And I think there's also a real bounce for Sudan as it takes itself out of this list of pariah states. The other denizens of the SST list are Iran, Syria, and North Korea. So Sudan clearly doesn't belong on that list. And so from that perspective alone, this does give real bounce to Sudan for its role in the international community.
And, this SST designation has often been held up as the thing that's holding the international community from offering more financial support, more of a lifeline to the new government in Sudan. Is there anything lined up that would come to Sudan now that this has been lifted? Do we have any idea on sort of numbers and timelines on when help would be on the way?
Well, the US has suggested that it is lining up a much larger package of aid, and perhaps perhaps more immediately, though, as I was able to speak to the French government earlier in the year, they have said that they were waiting for the lift of the SST designation to forgive $6 billion of Sudan's debt to France, all of it, and the US has also indicated a will to cancel Sudanese debt. This also precipitates some aid through a new bill that is being introduced in Washington. And so, I think this opens up a lot of space for foreign direct investment. People are going to feel investors are going to feel more able and more comfortable with dealing with Sudan.
So one of the demands from the Trump administration, and it looked a bit like a quid pro quo, was that Sudan had to normalize ties with Israel in order to get this delisting from these sanctions. How does this play politically inside Sudan?
Well, this has really occupied a lot of news space, and with good reason, I think. The economic concerns for Sunnis remain paramount, and I think still occupy the main area of concern for Sudanese. And if state sponsor of terrorism rescission can deliver an economic bounce in good time, then I think the quid pro quo, as you say, with Israel in exchange for normalization of relations with Israel will seem like a good deal for Sudanese. The concern, though, is that because Sudanese are already in a very worried and concerned and frustrated state because of the state of the economy, that the normalization with Israel perhaps could be harnessed as a new issue to beat the government with, and it could be a point of mobilization, especially amongst Islamist groups and groups who are associated with the former regime. And between those two, there is plenty of overlap. I do, as I said, I do think that there is a missed opportunity here for Prime Minister Hamdok. He had hung his name and his reputation in many ways on being able to bring Sudan off of the list. And he has not yet taken a victory lap. And I think in many ways this is because the Sudanese government and Sudanese generally remain very circumspect about this eventually happening. There is still a technical process in Washington that has to happen. And Sudanese remain very, perhaps they've been burned by previous attempts to come off the list. And they have seen the goalposts move in the past. And so as a result, there's a lot of wariness in Khartoum about this.
And we've touched on this already, but I'm just wondering, you were just there and you mentioned, as we've mentioned many times in this podcast, how Sudan's economy is in such dire straits. I mean, what did you see while you were there to just give an example of, what the Sudanese are facing right now?
Sure. It's been quite stark. I've been working in Sudan for a decade now, and really, the differences are clear. First of all, the exchange rate for the US dollar is 100 times it was when I arrived in the middle of 2010, and it's spiraling, into worse territory as we stand. And many key businesses, big businesses, have ceased production because it simply has ceased to become worth it to produce some of their products. And many stores have taken products off the shelves because their value gets eaten up so quickly. Sudan's inflation is second only to that of Venezuela. The other really obvious signs as you move around Khartoum in particular are fuel lines of cars, of motorbikes, of tuk-tuks that run for kilometers and are not just single file. They are often 3 or 4 abreast. Those cars are just standing there and they wait at night and they wait in the day. And you will also see people bringing mattresses to bakeries because they know that they are going to be sleeping out rough, waiting for the next delivery of bread because it is that scarce.
And of course, our concern at Crisis Group all along has been that with the lifting of the SST, that the U.S., was moving far too slow and that when it does come, it might be too little, too late. The other big news recently is the Juba peace deal, of course, as you mentioned. What exactly did Sudan agree to with these armed groups, many of which, of course, haven't actually fought inside Sudan in a long while?
Well, key here in the peace deal is really that this is a quite profound devolution of power and wealth outwards, if indeed the agreement is implemented as written. it really does attempt, at least, to address the root causes of conflict in Sudan, with including assurances that regions can keep the profits from the states and regions in which those profits are derived. The format that the negotiations and agreement took, which is to take regional tracks. There were 5. There was one from each of the compass points and then the center. But this has led to a situation in which Darfuri armed groups, who made up the preponderance of negotiators and really had brought the most to the table, they have come away with the best deal, I would suggest. And there was a lot of discord even within those signatories about the way that the Darfuris have come to dominate this deal. The deal also sets up many committees and bodies to address very specific issues such as return of IDPs and refugees and the always tricky issue of land. The other components include security sector reform, which includes integration of the armed groups into the Sudan Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, for those who cannot be integrated. But there are positions in government reserved at varying percentage levels for the signatories. And I think, key here is that, as you say, the main groups do remain outside. The 2 groups who really carry genuine constituencies and who carry the most in the way of military capacity. That's the Sudan Liberation Army of Abdul Wahid al-Noor, who is based in Darfur, and then the Sudan People's Liberation Army North of Abdulaziz al-Hilu. Both of those gentlemen have so far remained outside of the agreement, although Abdulaziz has been negotiating much more actively with the government and is now in Juba trying to see if he can find a way into the deal.
So even though those 2 big rebel groups, Abdul Wahid and Abdulaziz, didn't sign this peace deal, the scope of the signed text is actually still quite ambitious. So does this just come down to a question of whether and how they implement it?
Yes, the devil will definitely be in the implementation. The finance minister, the acting finance minister, had already put a $7.5 billion price tag on the peace deal. That comes out to about $7.5 billion. And Sudan is broke. They do not have the money to deliver that, and so they will be relying heavily, if not entirely, on the international community to fund what is, in fact, a very heavy deal. Part of the problem here is that the international community was largely absent in Juba. There were some technical presence, it's true, from the UK and the US, but on the whole, there was no consultation with the international community, and I think as such, what happened was that there were unrealistic expectations about just how enthused and the international community would be about this, and also misperceptions about just how deep the international community's pockets are in this day of COVID, of low oil prices, and increasing sort of insularity.
So, of course, the overall context of this is the power-sharing arrangement between the military and the civilians after Bashir fell out of power. Is it clear yet how this new peace deal with these armed groups, which side of that ledger it will end up weighing in on?
Well, signature of the Juba Agreement does change the entire dynamic by bringing the SRF into government. But more importantly, it does adjust the balance of power in the transitional government. I fear, though, this is not necessarily for the better, because it really appears to have empowered the military side of the equation in the transitional government. The FFC's key place in government, provided by their signature with the Transitional Military Council of the Constitutional Declaration, which really established this transitional period, is diluted by the entry of the SRF into all elements of the transitional government. That's the Council of Ministers, that is the Sovereign Council, and also the yet-to-be-formed Transitional Legislative Council. But it really didn't have to be this way, unfortunately. The FFC should have shown more flexibility in coming to an accord that brought the SRF, should have shown more flexibility in coming to an accord that brought the SRF into the Constitutional Declaration, and it would have bound the 2 blocks together. And they had these talks in July of 2019, but the FFC opted to go it alone and felt that it could go it alone. And so they alone signed the Constitutional Declaration with the Transitional Military Council. And this, of course, put the SRF in a position to forum shop. They still wanted to, of course, be part of the transition. And they found South Sudan ready and willing to host, and also the Emiratis ready and willing and able to pay for that forum. But what has happened is that the centrality of the military to the transition has been reinforced because they are now the prominent parties, both as co-signatory of the Constitutional Declaration, and now because they dominated the talks at Juba, they are the ones who are seen to have, in fact, struck this deal with the SRF. The civilians were, in large part, very much underrepresented at Juba. The FFC, who are on paper the executors of the revolution's values and political strength, were badly sidelined in Juba. So they really did not get to have as much influence as they really should have over the Juba agreement. And now they find themselves, as I said, diluted in the transitional government. My concern, though, was that Juba provided a forum for the SRF and the RSF in particular, who have Darfuri roots, despite their heavy recent recruitment across Sudan. But it provided a forum for those two to find common cause as fighters for the margin, seeking to redress the stark imbalances of post-independence Sudan. And it is really incumbent, perhaps, upon the international community as a convener to bring the FFC and the SRF back closer together so that they collectively can do better at being representatives of the revolution and civilians more broadly in this transitional government.
So in other words, what you're saying is that the answer might not be really neither the civilian political forces nor the old guard military, but rather this seems to maybe be lining up in General Hemeti's interest and possibly a center periphery realignment.
That is my core concern about how this is playing out. In many ways, this is simply because nobody really has taken a hold of this transitional process in general, and General Hemeti does seem like the only one who really has some direction and strategic approach to moving this transition ahead.
So we've also had a lot of unrest recently in eastern Sudan, which wasn't, hasn't been seen in recent years and decades as sort of the main restive area in Sudan. But we've seen, as I said, a lot of unrest there on the heels of this bigger peace deal. What's going on over there, and how does that fit into this wider picture?
Yes, the East, really is the emerging concern for Crisis Group. We judge in some ways that the East is rather a potentially greater tinderbox than Darfur currently, and this is seen, as you move around Kassala and Port Sudan in the East, people feel very unsafe as they move around the streets. They find themselves hurrying home after their work. The markets are much more empty, and there is just a general sense of worry and insecurity that pervades the key towns and cities in the East. Initially, a lot of this, the violence that will have started people's attention to the East started with clashes between Nuba and Beni Amr. But this has also now encompassed related concerns in the East that have been raised by Bidja groups who felt that they were not accurately represented at the table in Juba when the Juba agreement was being negotiated. And so these Bidja groups have sought to bring pressure to bear on the government to be included. They held a conference in Sinkat in Red Sea State about a month ago and called for self-determination at that point and had blocked off the roads to Sudan's all-important lifeline of Port Sudan. Further, into this and integral to that, that renewed intertribal discord really was the attempt to seat and then the firing subsequently of the Kassala governor Saleh Amar, who is himself a Beni Amr, but he was appointed in August and never made it out to Kassala at all. Such was the intensity of the protests against him. And so ultimately he was sacked earlier this month without ever having gone out to Kassala. The only other point here I really think that is really worth saying about the East is that really this now increasingly encompasses a regional dynamic, and that particularly brings concerns that are emanating from Tigray and are a byproduct of Tigray's own competition with Addis Ababa. There are signs of a proxy war, between TPLF and Eritrea, and this is very much a subset of our grave concerns about stability in Ethiopia, as much a subset about our grave concerns about Sudanese stability.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into some more regional and bigger picture questions dealing with this transition in Sudan. One of the features of this transition has been the Sudanese revolution from the beginning was, of course, an incredible show of force from the Sudanese people, and then you have all these outside players who got involved. The main backers of the military side. Some have dubbed the Arab Troika, that's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt. The civilian side is seen as being backed often by Western powers. Now that we're like more than a year into this power sharing arrangement, is that basic breakdown still holding true, or is that a bit too reductive?
That does still hold true, and I'm sad to see that, because there is a real need for I think a more productive role for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in Sudan. There really is a diversity of concepts of just what transition in Sudan means across many of the actors who stakeholders who are seen to be active in Sudan, and many of these are mutually exclusive. And I think that's really the problem of the international community, getting onto a single page and then pushing in a cohesive way for Sudan to advance its transition. For Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the preference has clearly been for the military, and certainly that means that they have not favored the civilian side of the equation. The entire amount of $750 million of the promised $3 billion that the Saudis and Emiratis promised during the revolution was only disbursed during the time that the military was in control. That is before August, when the Forces for Freedom and Change signed the constitutional declaration with the Transitional Military Council. The further evidence of this is that, in the last year or so before Bashir had left, there were billions of dollars that were channeled into Sudan's central bank to support Bashir. And yet very little support has really found its way to back the civilian dispensation, the civilian-led government in Khartoum. There's also some divergence here between, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which tend to support the Sudan Armed Forces because of abiding past relationships with SAF. And you also see the Emirates standing much more readily behind the Rapid Support Forces of General Hemeti. If you speak with Rapid Support Forces and Sudan Armed Forces, however, they will both rigidly insist that they are a single entity. But if you dig a little deeper, there are some quite problematic divisions between those two components of Sudan's military that are cause for their own concern over domestic stability.
So in summary, it's been almost a year and a half since the Sunnis people took Omar al-Bashir out of power. Is it clear yet exactly where Sudan is heading, what this new political dispensation in Sudan, really looks like? What a post-Bashir Sudan looks like?
Well, no, I think it's not yet clear what post-Bashir Sudan looks like. And I think that's in part because nobody internationally or domestically has been able to get a hold of the transition to sort of push it or pull it in any particular direction. So the net effect there is that many of the parties who have interests in the direction of the transition are hedging. So people, different stakeholders and parties are all existing in orbit without ever really landing their interests and bringing them to bear on the transition and therefore pushing that transition in a particular direction. At the center of this really is the question of the economy. We certainly see the economy as the core political risk for Sudan and for the transition more broadly. And without really expeditious intervention internationally and reforms domestically, this is the kind of issue that can sink the transition. In part, this is also because the civilians' ability to illustrate to Sudanese that they are, in fact, the sort of dispensation that can adequately respond to Sudanese needs that have been expressed during the revolution, freedom, peace, and justice. A civilian government's ability to respond to those calls really is wrapped up in their ability to get a hold of the economy so that it can, in fact, show that it can deliver for Sudanese. Similarly, the clinching of the Juba Agreement on 3rd of October also provides some changes, not least of which is the emerging relationship between the SRF and the RSF that came out of that forum. And this is certainly a concern for a crisis group in the way that this perhaps tilts the balance of power within the transitional government, potentially away from the civilians who are primarily represented by the Forces for Freedom and Change or FFC. But it also concerns those at the center, the old guard and the riverine elite who have traditionally held power in Khartoum, because they see this SRF-RSF coalition as a coalition of the margins. And that represents a very fundamental flip of the traditional power balance that has persisted in Sudan since independence. And our concern really is of the reaction or backlash to that emerging coalition of the margins, but from those in the center who have a great deal to lose should those from Darfur, from South Kordofan, from Blue Nile find common cause across rebel and military lines and start to bring to bear the interests of the margins.
Okay, and finally, Jonas, moving aside from politics, I'm just curious, what's the pandemic look like from Khartoum?
It's quite striking. There is very little sign that COVID-19 is an issue or a theme in Sudan. There had been a spike of cases and deaths in May and June, and that precipitated, lockdowns to some degree, and people masking up and being much more concerned about COVID-19. But since then, it has been very quiet. As you move around the streets in Khartoum, it's very noticeable when you see somebody moving around wearing a mask. And life really seems to be moving on as normal, and this doesn't seem to be, manifesting in a spike in cases per se either. But the data also is very spotty.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Jonas, for coming on, and glad you're back in Nairobi.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, as always, for listening to The Horn. To find out more about Crisis Group's work, visit our website at crisisgroup.org. You can also check out our new global podcast, co-hosted by Crisis Group's president, Rob Malley, Hold Your Fire. And we also have a podcast on Europe, War and Peace. Once again, I'm Alan Boswell. This podcast is produced by Maeve Francis.